Hi guys, welcome to the guide. In this episode we're going to be going over the Grumman F4F Wildcat, the United States Navy's mainline frontline fighter for the first 2 years of the war in the Pacific, or the first 2 years that the United States was involved in the war. So from 1941 to 1943 it was the fighter of choice for the United States Navy. Well, maybe not fighter of choice, but it was the only fighter that they had. So, just by that, it's pretty much what they got stuck with. It proved to be a very mediocre fighter, especially for the first 2 years of the war. It was rugged, it was well built, but it could not keep up with the Japanese Zero. And it was a pretty rude awakening by the United States whenever they found this out, because the thought process of any white society of the time was that all of our stuff is 10 times better than anybody else's, and there's no way somebody of color can have a better of anything than us. So it was a very rude awakening to the United States whenever they found out that the Japanese Zero and pretty much the rest of the Japanese aircraft were better than anything that the United States had in its arsenal. So the United States was able to get a 1-to-1 kill to death ratio, I guess that's how I'm going to phrase it, to their Japanese counterparts as the war progressed. But for the first year of the war, it was not a good time to be a pilot in the United States Navy. Alright, so let's get to the specs. The Wildcat has a wingspan of 38 feet and was 28 feet long. It was a pretty short, stout, squatty little fighter. It made for a hard target to hit. It had a top speed of 330 miles per hour at 21,000 feet. This is the third version that came off the assembly line, so this isn't the original version. But I think the original version was like right at 300 miles per hour. But that had a 900 horsepower engine. This version they upgraded that to a 1200 horsepower Pratt & Whitney 14 cylinder radial engine. So that's what got it up to 330 miles per hour. And it was a radial engine, which only added to its ruggedness, because radial engines are some robust engines that they just want to keep going. It had a range of 845 miles. This version was armed with 650 caliber machine guns, which became the mainstay of United States aircraft all up throughout the Korean War. But the first couple versions of the Wildcat were only armed with 450 caliber machine guns, which is what the one that I'm flying only has 4, which isn't quite enough to do the job, if I must be honest, at least in the game and I think in real life. It's 650 caliber machine guns is quite a bit of firepower, but 4 just isn't quite enough. And it also had enough room for 200 pounds worth of bombs. And yeah, I'm sorry. It's a pretty boring fighter to me. I'm gonna be honest. It's not my favorite fighter. I mean, the landing gear, for crying out loud. The pilot in the cockpit had a little crank that he manually cranked up and down the landing gear. Like, it's a pretty boring, bare bones fighter all around. There's nothing fancy about this plane. I'm sorry. It's just kind of a boring fighter all around. I mean, that's personal opinion. I'm sure somebody out there loves the Wildcat, but I'm just not one of them. Alright. Its first flight was on September 2nd, 1937. And at the time, it was in competition with another aircraft built by the Brewster Company called the F-2A Buffalo. I did another video on that. You can find that if you want. Though I would note that I figured out the new control scheme, and I figured out how to fly make it so you fly realistically. So in that video, I was still using the regular, like the novice control scheme that just comes by default, because I hadn't found how to switch it over to the realistic control scheme. So I found that out. So pretty much from this video and the P40 video on, I will do my best to fly in the realistic control scheme, because that just makes it more interesting. And the point of these videos is to get you to see how they really flew and get some useful information out of it while still hopefully entertaining you. Alright, but besides that side note, yeah, it first flew September 2nd, 1937. It was officially adopted after it was chosen to be the slightly better airplane of the two, between it and the Buffalo. It was officially adopted by the U.S. on October 1st, 1941. It saw combat on Wake Island during the defense of that island, and it didn't do too well on Wake Island. Then it saw combat at the Battle of Coral Sea, where I believe it got about a 1-to-1 death ratio, and that's whenever the American pilots were figuring out how to fly it to its advantages. And then it was the main fighter at the Battle of Midway, where the United States was finally able to make the Japanese Navy turn tail and go on the defensive. So that's kind of the stages of the Wildcat, where the Battle of Wake Island, it was flown by novice pilots that didn't know how to fly the plane to its advantages, and flew pretty much to the advantages of the Japanese Zero pilots. And then the Battle of Coral Sea, where they were starting to figure things out. And then the Battle of Midway, where they finally got their crap together and were able to turn the tables against the Japanese. Overall, it did prove to be a very rugged airplane. It was one of the first planes to have self-sealing fuel tanks, which is a very useful thing in aerial combat. It makes the plane catching on fire a lot harder, which the Japanese planes did not have throughout the war, and the Japanese never quite figured that out, which is why Japanese aircraft were pretty infamous for lighting on fire. Like, they light up like matches, and that is not a way I'd prefer to avoid going. But, you know, their mentality was way different than the American mentality throughout the war. The Wildcat was used throughout the war. It was pushed out of frontline service as like the main fighter aircraft in 1943, but it was still used on escort carriers, smaller carriers, throughout the war, and was continually upgraded throughout the war. It started production in 1939, and it didn't, and they kept producing them until August 1945. So just because they stopped being frontline fighters didn't mean they just completely went away. They were still there, and they were still around. And by the end of the war, they were able to get a kill-to-death ratio of 6 enemy airplanes for 1 Wildcat, which is pretty good. But also, by the end of the war, like, Japan was just throwing up whoever was stupid enough to get into the cockpit and go fly. Once Midway happened, the quality of the average Japanese pilot began to drop. Because the Japanese, at the beginning of the war, they had a pool of pilots who had years of experience in combat to take from. They had been, you know, fighting in China since the mid-30s. They had pilots that knew what they were doing, and their biggest problem was they wouldn't take these pilots off the front line and send them back home to Japan and use these pilots to train the new pilots and give the new pilots, the new recruits, real-world experience of what to expect in actual combat. Unlike the Americans, they would send their veteran pilots back to the States to train the new recruit pilots and, like, you know, give them an idea of what to expect. The Japanese didn't do that. Instead, they would just keep their good veteran pilots on the front line until eventually you're going to run out of luck and you're going to get shot down. It doesn't matter how good you are. I mean, even the Red Baron got shot down. Like, it doesn't matter how much skill you are. Your luck's going to run out sooner or later and you're going to get shot down. And the Japanese never learned that lesson, and pretty much by the middle of the war they had lost their huge pool of highly experienced pilots, and that's really what gave the Americans the advantage. Yeah, thanks for watching. I mean, that's enough of a ramble. I gotta cut it off early.